Well, I thought I'd start my comments today by saying that one of the most common sayings in the English language, and I'm sure in most other as well, is that history repeats itself. And for some time now, we have been gathering here at the grave sites of our parents, our parents, your grandfather, your great grandparents, in remembrance of the great tragedies that engulfed them and hundreds of thousands of Christian Armenians at the hands of the Turks, the Kurds, other Muslims so many years ago. And now in the same part of the world, the horrors that afflicted our people are being repeated throughout the Middle East in places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, even countries in Africa where Christians are being slaughtered by Muslim terrorists. And really we don't know the depth of the suffering of the Christians in these areas because they're incredibly dangerous, and they're especially dangerous for Western reporters that the networks, the newspapers, whatever, are afraid to send their people down there. We already know of journalists that have been actually killed, heads cut off, whatever. So it's very, very dangerous to send any news media into these areas. And this is one reason why we only have a little bit of this story as to really what's taken place by this group, by ISIS, by the Taliban, by groups like this. In some of the areas, these so-called holy warriors, they're doing their best to eradicate any vestiges of Christian and Western civilization. Okay, and I want you to turn to that first map that we have, just to give you an idea of some of the areas we're talking about here. If you look down at Syria, which is the lavender part, I've got two areas there, and I'm sure some of you know about this. The ISIS, after capturing the ancient Greek-Roman Smyrna, central Syria, they destroyed much of the splendid architecture, over 2,000 years old. They just literally destroyed it. Fortunately, when the people went back in there after the Syrians had pushed ISIS out of there, they were keeping their fingers crossed. They thought everything would be gone, but evidently there's still about 80% of that city that's been still fairly intact. And then. And by the way, that was a place that was designated as a World Heritage Site, so you know how important it was to history. Then there was another town on the map that I have, that second arrow, I always have trouble pronouncing it, Quarriatane, and I know you can't quite read, but it's that second arrow to the left of Palmyra. This was another gorgeous city of antiquity. It was captured by ISIS, remained under their control for a period of 10 months before the Syrian government troops recaptured it. And at the time ISIS came in, the city had a population of 40,000 people, including many Christians. Many Christians escaped before ISIS came in. Many did not, and they were killed. And those that survived were forced to pay a special tax because they were non-Muslims. I assume if they had converted, they probably could have saved the tax money. So while ISIS was in control of this city, they again attempted to wipe out all vestiges of Christendom. And as an example, they totally bulldozed a once cherished pilgrimage site, the 5th century monastery of St. Elian. So here we are almost 100 years after the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Armenian Christians, which profoundly affected the lives of our parents and those that suffered from even the earlier massacres that took place before our parents were afflicted. So the same monstrous crimes are being committed on today's Christians by people who can only be described as Muslim, and I'm putting this word in, psychopaths. Considering the absolute cruelty to these people, cutting off their heads, the looting, the pillaging, it's just too much to describe. And as I said, we even don't have the full story today. Now, I don't want to dwell, too much on these tragedies that Christians are experiencing in the Middle East. But I have to say this: I'm absolutely frustrated and appalled over the the tepid responses of European governments and our own government to the atrocities taking place. One would think that these political leaders representing Christian Europe would be shouting in righteous indignation, calling for justice, pointing out to every Muslim government that these fanatics are assaulting Christianity in the name of their prophet Muhammad. And it's, with a sad heart that I have to add this thought too, that, perhaps the lack of caring by Western governments simply reflect the indifference of the people they represent. And if that's the case, that's the saddest situation of all. That's the saddest of all. And then, a final thought on what is happening today. If you just think about this, because I know you've all been reading about this huge refugee influx. I said that beyond the suffering of the Christians, there is a wider catastrophe taking place in the Middle East. And because all the fighting, not just the Christians are suffering, but millions of Muslims as well. In Syria, at least half the population has fled from their homes. And the majority pouring into Turkey, using it as a passageway in seeking a safe haven in Europe. And my thought, is this not one of the greatest ironies of history? While the last vestiges of Christianity are being crushed in the Middle East by Muslim terrorists, millions of other Muslims flocking into Europe, Christian Europe, seeking peace and safety. Now, if that's not one of the greatest ironies of all, and I added this comment, I can only see our Lord shaking his head from side to side. It's amazing. And some of you are aware, like in Germany, for example, they've already accepted 1 million Muslims in about 1 year into their country, into a Europe where Christianity is fading. Now, in our previous gatherings at this place, we've discussed the tragedies experienced by our mothers and fathers, what they went through in finding safe haven in the U.S., meeting in Oberlin, marrying, but much of this narrative, and I know I've mentioned this to you before, much of this narrative before they both came to the U.S. Has sizable gaps in it. And I know I've mentioned this, and we keep looking for little tidbits. And I've always regretted the fact I did not extract from them a more complete story of their histories. I know Lydia, Aram, you've asked questions, and other people, your cousin Rick has been very interested in this. And I have to say, well, you know, I really am not sure about that. It's been very, very frustrating to me. So, my only excuse growing up is that young people, and young people might think about this. I said in my notes here, I said, young people they only dwell in the present. Well, you know, what's happening today and what the future might present. The past is past. Why concern yourself about that? So by the time I seriously wanted to fill the gaps in the narrative, the folks had passed on. So this made me dependent on books and periodicals and historical narratives, articles, interviews, things like that. And so I was always been on the alert for things, and I've discovered quite a few things recently by reading various things. And anyway, Roxana said, oh, look, here's a book about Smyrna. And and it's just been published. And I said, you know, there might be something, another person. This is not the first book on Smyrna. And so thanks to Lydia and Jeff, because I didn't think we were going to get the book in time, I got the book. And, well, so the first thing I did, as I've done before, is I went to the index, and I said Khachadourian, because I found references to her in other books. Now this book is probably, when I looked at the bibliography, it's probably the most thorough, most researched book about what took place in Smyrna. I mean, it's a real story, but the story is not just obviously about Mom. It's this whole situation of what was taking place in Smyrna. But I kept going through the index, and you get a kick out of this, Grace. So I'm going down through the index, and I'm just seeing, is there anything that, and I come down and I see Mills, Minnie. I said, Mom was always talking about Miss Mills, the director at the American Girls College. And I thought, could that be her Miss Mills? So I turned to the reference, and I picked up the story, and I thought the American Girls School, where our mother first was a student and then was a teacher. And I said, oh, the American Girls School, and I'm going to read you a couple of passages of this book. The American Girls School had grown even more desperate. Now there's already fires, and the Turks have already pushed the Greek army out and are now coming into Smyrna. And the building, which wrapped around a gated courtyard, was in the neighborhood where most of the looting and killing had taken place. The school had 12 American sailors as guards. By this time, with everything going on and the Turkish army entering, navies, the American Navy, the British Navy, the French Navy, the Italian Navy, the Russian Navy, all these ships had gathered around Constantinople and in Smyrna, in the Bay of Smyrna. And the Americans, because there was a consulate in Smyrna, knew exactly who the Americans were that were in Smyrna. So several destroyers came in. Sailors went into these areas to round up the Americans, bring them down to the quay, put them in a theater on the quay, and bring them, and then when they were ready, to move them to the destroyers to get them out. And so they knew that this was an American school run by Americans, and so they had already brought sailors up to this school. The school had 12 American sailors as guards and was directly across the street from Basmahan Station, though its front door opened onto a side street, Chinarli Street. The teachers had witnessed shootings and stabbings since Saturday when the Turkish cavalry had first arrived. and the streets outside the building had become impassable. Start picturing this. Piled high with rummaged goods, broken carts, and bodies. Minnie Mills was the school's director. Minnie Mills was the school's director. She had deep experience in Turkey. She had been a missionary teacher in Smyrna since 1897. This was her 25th year since arriving at the girls' school. She was 50 years old. And when Mom ever referred to this, she was always talking about Miss Mills, Miss Mills, Miss Mills. That morning, she had seen Turkish soldiers break into nearby homes, light fires, and spread them with petroleum they poured from tins. The fires flared under the accelerant and drew close to the schools. But Miss Mills had decided to remain with the students and her colleagues. On that Wednesday, the missionary teachers had responsibility for the school staff and school students and staff, as well as 1,200 refugees from the neighborhood. And if you can picture the school was sort of like a U. The buildings around here, there's a big courtyard in the center, an iron gate, an iron fence, and a gate, and already people from the neighborhood. And I think this is a good time now for you to flip over to get some idea of what we're talking to. And by the way, this map was in this book, and it's the first time I've seen the map. You might just, I'm just going to acquaint you now with, so you get an idea of what's going to happen here. Where is the key where these ships, the bay out here, several ships tied up at the quay, other ships out in the harbor. Now, wait a minute, that's the quay. That's the water. And the arrow here is where the college is. That's the American Girls College, and that's where they were. So now you get some idea of where the school was, and how far the quay was, just to get you oriented. And by the way, if you'll notice, the author has put a ring that encompasses the Armenian quarter and the Greek quarter. You notice there's no, and you see these little fire symbols? Interesting, isn't it? You see the little fire symbols? Only around the Armenian and Greek quarters. You don't see any fire down in the Turkish quarter or even the Jewish quarter. Okay? So just kind of keep that map handy, because you'll find as I get into this narrative. So anyway, in the school, they had allowed a number of these refugees from the neighborhood, and based on where the school was, you can see you probably have both Greek and Armenian people. Evidently, originally, men, women, and children came in, but the Navy, the sailors, decided they were only going to allow the women and children to stay, and the men the people were all women and children. The school staff had counted 8 new babies among the refugees. One woman had given birth while at the school, and several women were expected to deliver this day. Many of the refugees were camped in the courtyard. They had brought a few into the school, but most of them were still out in the courtyard. The locked iron gates separated them from the Turkish soldiers in the street. The Turkish soldiers were around here. The school had been feeding them as best it could with soup and bread. Turkish soldiers had tried several times to enter the courtyard, but were frustrated by the gate and the American sailors. Then at 4 p.m. In the afternoon, a Navy ensign, his name was Thomas Gaylord, and 4 additional sailors arrived to evacuate the teachers. The Navy men told Miss Mills that they had come to take only Americans, but she refused to depart without the school's children, principally Greek and Armenian. In other words, she meant everybody, including the staff, which included Mom. But Ensign Gaylord told her she would come along on her own, or a sailor would carry her back. And this is getting into some of the things that Mom had told us about leaving the school. Miss Mills was determined to stay with the children. The standoff continued and the fire touched the building. Miss Mills planted herself. She wasn't moving without the children. And this is where he said, Gaylord had 4 of the sailors carry Miss Mills. He said, you either walk or we. Carried Miss Mills basically on their shoulders to the truck they had parked outside the door, and promised her that they would leave a contingent of sailors to lead the children and the school staff to the quay. The truck with Miss Mills and other teachers departed, and it's at this time that we read about, as she's being hustled off, she's turning back to the other teachers, and she kept saying, follow me, follow me, follow me. And Mom said they heard her, and then the remaining 7 sailors, including Petty Officer Webster, brought the children and the staff together and led them out the door. And when we left, Webster wrote in a letter, we could hardly get out the door, and some of the Turks fired into the crowd and killed a few people. And this is another thing that we had picked up when Mom was being interviewed about what happened. And she said, we all rushed out the door, trying to get out the door, and you know, that sort of comedy routine where you're all trying to get out, and there's so many of it, nobody gets out. Anyway, she said, but I fell. And she said, all of a sudden, I felt these strong arms pick me up. One of the sailors standing at the door picked her up. And she said, I would have been trampled if that sailor hadn't picked me up. She said, he saved my life. So, all right. So now they get out, and you can picture Mom, the other teachers, these kids, the young girls. And the group started toward, and now you get some idea. Now, there's the arrow to the quay, and here's the school. And unfortunately, there's no indication of distance here. But I've heard several, like this could be as long as 4 miles from the school to the quay. I'm not sure, but it was a distance. So the group started toward the Rue, I can't pronounce these names, Richidia, the main avenue leading through the Armenian quarter to the quay. But the fire stopped them. They turned back toward the school to find a different route, and as they passed the school, the sailors saw that Turkish soldiers, now remember though, they didn't take the refugees. The refugees are still there. They only took the school personnel. And saw that the Turkish soldiers had begun shooting the refugees in the courtyard, the women and children. That was the last time they saw them. The group followed Chinarli Street in the opposite direction for a short distance and then turned left toward the quay, wending its way through the crosshatch neighborhood. And you get some little idea from this map about these streets were not all laid out at right angles, and this is a very, very old city. Wending its way through the crosshatch neighborhood without any clear sense of where it was. The streets, which sometimes jogged right or left, were not arranged in neat squares nor rectangles. They crossed each other at acute angles as well as right angles, and sometimes the streets dead-ended at masonry walls. And then the author stops this story of these people, the teachers and the students, gets into a few other things, but then he picks up the story again. And it talks about Petty Officer Webster leading this group, who were leading the group that had left the American college, had gotten lost on the way to the quay. With the fire raging and dense smoke making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of them, they pushed on toward the quay as best they could determine. The setting sun was bright red ball of fire, and it showed the way westward toward the waterfront. The fire often blocked their way, and they encountered crowds of people who were trying to find their way to the waterfront, and crowds pushed them off their intended course. But it was like being caught in the middle of a cattle drive, except instead of dust and dirt, there were smoke and cinders. You can imagine the absolute chaos. And Mom, in her little diary, had written that once she got out and they were all running, she said she lost her shoes. She lost her shoes, so she was running basically barefoot in stocking feet. And she said the streets with stuff burning. She said, I was walking over cinders. And which is exactly what the author says, that there were smoke and cinders. And Mom mentions in her little diary that I was walking on cinders. And it was difficult to keep the group together in the chaos and smoke. But the teachers continually pulled the children who had become separated back into the line, or the semblance of a line. From time, to their horror, they lost children along the way, and they didn't find them. Once they lost them, they couldn't go running up side streets and stuff looking for them. This was total chaos, and I'm going to mention about Mom's situation in just a minute. The group had to keep moving. It was impossible to stop for more than a few minutes and search for them. And there was yet another macabre element to the chaos. The fire was dislodging innumerable squeaking rats from the burning buildings. So, I mean, you just can't imagine. You just can't imagine this nightmare. And they formed into packs and were moving away from the heat and toward the waterfront. And then Webster, in his diary, the petty officer, we were about a mile from the docks, and none of the sailors knew the way, and people that did were so scared they couldn't talk. When we went out, we had to go through the streets that were on fire, and some of the front of the buildings had fallen into the streets. We had all the people in the back, and every little bit we had to stop and fire over their heads of the crowd to keep them from running over us. It took me an hour to get to the docks, and I got lost from the rest of the crowd. There were a couple of hundred people following the route. And then to finish off, the group needed to move west toward the quay, but the fire kept pushing them north until they reached Galazio Street, which ran east to west from the waterfront to the back of the city. They turned left on Galazio past the British consulate and the American consulate, where they spotted by Charles Davis, who hailed them, and then to the quay. The sailors led them toward the theater, spotted the staging area that had been cleared astern of the destroyer Litchfield, which was actually at the dock. And meanwhile, Petty Officer finally reached the waterfront. I could hardly get to the headquarters building, which was actually a movie theater that they had used as headquarters. As people were packed on the docks like sardines, we began picking out girls that had been at the school and sent them to the Litchfield. Now, from the stories and what we know is all of this chaos, we're almost positive, we know Mom did not get on the Litchfield. She got separated. They were all getting separated, but she was still together with some of the teachers. She was still together. And according to what she said is that they got down to the docks, and then they encountered sailors, and she said we were rowed out to one of the destroyers. And we know the destroyer Simpson, which we're sure is the destroyer that took her and some of the other teachers away from Smyrna. We're almost positive it was the Simpson. And she said, we rowed out about a half a mile, and the Simpson, according to the book, was anchored about 250 yards away from the dock. So, that's, she was incredibly lucky. She was incredibly lucky. As I said, I found this book to be probably one of the best reference books. and all of this business about the American Girls College and exactly what our mother was experiencing was